The camera was never supposed to be on. The synod, an ancient gathering shrouded in marble tradition, was meant to remain behind velvet doors, heard only by cardinals, whispered about by aides, and buried beneath centuries of silent obedience. But someone, somewhere, flipped a switch. And now, across continents and cathedrals, millions were watching. In the middle of that sacred circle stood Pope Leo XIV, bare, unguarded, and fully awake to the war he had just stepped into. Across from him, Cardinal Matteo Russo rose with polished grace, his red robe draping like a banner of defiance. Russo's voice was calm, but his words cut deep. "Your Holiness, your actions are causing tremors through the pillars of our church. Do you really believe you alone can decide what must fall?" There was a pause. A silence that didn't wait for oxygen. Pope Leo turned his gaze toward the cardinal, not as a king to a rival, but as a shepherd to a lost brother. And then, with a voice neither defensive nor proud, he answered, "I don't decide what must fall. I simply refuse to keep standing, where Christ would have walked away." And for a moment, one trembling moment, the entire room forgot how to breathe. Comment where you're watching from. And if that truth cracks something open in you, subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. But if you still won't, enter the comments. And tell us. What are you afraid it will expose? Pope Leo XIV had never intended to be pope. He was a man shaped more by silence than ceremony, formed not in lecture halls or marble basilicas, but in field hospitals, refugee camps, and war-torn slums where faith was not recited, but clung to like oxygen. His cassock had once been stained with the blood of children he tried to save. His sermons, whispered in underground churches, were heard by mothers hiding from airstrikes and fathers who hadn't seen a peaceful night's sleep in years. They called him the shepherd of the forgotten. And for decades, the Vatican barely spoke his name. Until it could no longer ignore the call of a world choking on tradition but starving for truth. Across from him stood Cardinal Matteo Russo, a man whose name adorned university wings, whose shadow loomed over every synod, every decree. Russo didn't need to shout to command a room, his presence was sculpted, his speech refined. And to many within the church, he was the church. Its order, its intellect, its old, unyielding spine. He viewed Leo not as a threat, but as a well-meaning disaster. And yet, on this day, in the hall of the Apostolic Constitution, under frescoes that had watched popes rise and kingdoms fall, the power dynamic had quietly shifted. The world was watching. Not through filtered press releases, but through an unplanned, raw broadcast that no aide had time to cancel. This room, usually drenched in incense and secrecy, now echoed with breathless anticipation. Because earlier that week, 6 cardinals, each tied to decades of whispered scandal, financial manipulation, or deliberate inaction, had received personal letters. Letters not of accusation, but of invitation. "You are called," they read, "not to defend yourselves, but to remember who you were before the robes became armor." The letters bore no threats. But everyone knew what they meant. This was not a purge. It was a reckoning. Not political, but spiritual. Not for punishment, but for confession. And Cardinal Russo, guardian of the old guard, had risen to stand between them and the one man unwilling to bow to silence. So no, this was not a debate over policies. It was a battle for the soul of the church. If you still think this is about politics, you've already missed the gospel. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories, not for updates, but for accountability. And if you won't, tell us in the comments, what makes you uncomfortable about transparency in faith? Cardinal Russo's voice was velvet-draped steel. He did not accuse. He inquired. "Your Holiness," he began, hands folded, posture elegant, "we are, of course, grateful for your zeal. But surely, even zeal must kneel before order. Reform, after all, is not rebellion. Do you believe the faithful understand the line you walk?" It was phrased like concern. Almost affectionate. But the room knew better. Pope Leo did not flinch. He looked at Rousseau as one might look at a former friend, someone once loved, now unfamiliar. "I don't believe the faithful fear reform," he said quietly. "I believe they fear silence. And they have good reason to." There was a flicker in Rousseau's eye. Just a flicker. The Pope's voice remained soft, almost too soft for a room of marble and echo. But every syllable carried weight, as if dipped in the gravity of something older than protocol. Rousseau pressed on, a small smile curving the edge of his lip. "But isn't it dangerous, Holy Father, to allow speculation to precede proof? When cardinals are named in whispers, and then invited to step down before inquiry?" He paused, letting the insinuation hang like incense in stale air. "Is that justice, or judgment?" Leo turned, resting a single hand on the polished table before him. "Justice," he said, "is not a courtroom. Not here. Not now. Justice begins when men of power voluntarily step into light, before they're dragged into it." The air shifted, slightly. Rousseau adjusted his cuffs. "And yet," he said, "your approach feels disruptive. Heavy-handed. Does it not risk undermining the very unity we've spent centuries preserving?" Leo's gaze did not move. "Unity built on avoidance," he answered, "is not unity. It's choreography." That landed differently. Some cardinals leaned back. Some looked down. Some simply blinked slower than usual. The tension in the room was not loud. But it thickened. Spread. Every word now carried the risk of becoming history. And the truth sat quietly between them, like an uninvited guest no one dared acknowledge. This was still the opening act. But already, the tone had shifted. There were no raised voices. No accusations. Just polished words, layered with silent daggers. A war of robes and rhetoric. A standoff between comfort and conscience. If this feels too familiar, leaders cloaking fear in courtesy, hiding decay behind doctrine, subscribe to faith-hidden stories. Because someone has to name it. And if you won't, tell us in the comments, why does comfort feel safer than confrontation? Cardinal Rousseau no longer smiled. The lines of diplomacy hardened. The room, once draped in rhetorical velvet, began to crack at its edges. He straightened, glanced briefly toward the 5 other cardinals seated along the right-hand arc of the synodal table, men whose titles reached farther than their names ever would. A slight nod passed between them. Silent approval. Calculated unity. Then Rousseau spoke, not as a question this time, but as an indictment cloaked in ritual. "Your Holiness," he said, "you speak often of brokenness, of confession, of wounds beneath vestments. And yet, in 19 days, you've publicly unsettled traditions older than any of us at this table. You've reawakened old allegations. Stirred unrest among the laity. And now you risk fracturing the very church you claim to shepherd." The word fracturing clanged like iron on stone. Another cardinal, Monsignor Leclerc of Lyon, joined him. "We are not afraid of truth," he said gently. "We are afraid of scandal dressed as virtue." Pope Leo didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes. And in that breathless pause, the silence bloomed, not from fear, but from a sense that something old and hidden was about to be named aloud. When he opened his eyes again, they were not the eyes of a man being attacked. They were the eyes of a man remembering a child. "There was a boy," he said quietly, "in a refugee clinic outside Mosul. 7 years old. His legs had been shattered by mortar fire. His sister, burned in front of him. No one moved. I sat beside him for hours. Not to speak. Just to be there. But as the sun set, he turned to me and whispered something I will never forget." He looked at Rousseau. He asked me, "Will God still love me after what happened?" A single cough echoed in the back of the chamber. Leo's voice did not tremble, but something deeper than voice filled the room now. I did not tell him about councils, he continued. Or catechism. Or tradition. I didn't recite dogma to a child whose bones were visible beneath gauze. I just held his hand. And I told him, yes. God does not abandon the broken. Only men do that. He turned toward the table. And I swore that day, I would never again stand behind a curtain of silence if the cost was a child's voice unheard. No one interrupted. Because something ancient had shifted. Rousseau cleared his throat, but the power he once wielded in the pause between words, was fading. Leo's next words came not as rebuttal, but revelation. The Church's role is not to protect its image. It is to protect the innocent. And if those two ever come into conflict, then may the image burn. The words hung in the air like incense, sacred, sharp, and unfiltered. No rebuttal followed. Just the weight of a truth no one wanted to carry, yet could no longer set down. If you've ever wished the Church spoke like this. If you've ever longed for truth to sound like a shepherd and not a shield, subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. And if you won't, tell us in the comments. What truth are you still hoping someone else will say first? It was subtle at first. A tightening of Rousseau's jaw. A faint tremor in the way his fingers adjusted the crimson sash that draped his chest. The mask of calm, cultivated through decades of diplomacy, began to falter. He leaned forward, not toward the Pope, but toward the room. His voice grew louder, not in anger, but in performance. Your Holiness, he said, I do not question your heart. But I must question your wisdom. The room braced itself. You speak beautifully of wounds, of mercy, of forgotten children, and yet you act like a populist, not a pope. You sway the emotions of the world while risking the foundation of the Church. There was no applause. No reaction. Only the slow, collective inhale of a room on the edge of rupture. Rousseau's gaze narrowed. His voice sharpened. You call for transparency, but you cast suspicion. You offer healing, but plant division. You say you stand for the innocent. But what of the faithful confused by your silence on doctrine? What of the bishops whose reputations you unravel with gestures and parables? And finally, the line he had come prepared to deliver, are you the successor of Peter, or the darling of public opinion? The accusation sliced through the air. For a heartbeat, Pope Leo said nothing. He simply looked at Rousseau, not as an adversary, but as a man who had once stood at the same altar and forgotten why. Then slowly, he reached into the pocket of his cassock and pulled out something small, weathered, barely holding together by its thread. A rosary. But not made of gold. Not draped in jewels. Just black beads, charred at the edges, some melted into shapes no longer round. He held it gently in his palm and spoke, not to Rousseau, but to the room. This rosary, he said, was pulled from the ashes of a village in El Salvador. The woman who owned it died protecting the children inside her chapel. She burned with them. But the rosary survived. He looked up. I do not wear rings for power. I do not carry staffs for symbolism. I carry this, because it reminds me who I serve. He placed it on the table between them. You call it naive to protect the innocent, he said. I call it sacred. No one moved. A bird outside the stained glass window cried out. The creak of an ancient chair echoed like thunder. Cardinal Rousseau did not speak again. Because in that moment, the confrontation had shifted. It was no longer about policy or protocol. It was about moral memory. About what the Church was called to be, not by decree, but by crucifixion. And in the presence of that truth, even power felt embarrassed. If that moment moved you, don't scroll past it. Don't forget it like so many have before. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. And if you still won't, then tell us in the comments, what kind of church are you still waiting for? Pope Leo did not sit down. The rosary still rested on the table before him, its blackened beads absorbing the light like a quiet rebuke to everything ornate and hollow in the room. He turned, not just to Rousseau now, but to all of them. The cardinals seated in their centuries-old hierarchy. The secretaries with pens frozen mid-air. The cameras still rolling, unknown to most of the world watching that this was not a speech, it was a reckoning. "Let me be clear," Leo said, his voice as steady as marble warmed by sun. "I have not condemned any man in this room. I have not named guilt. I have asked only for reflection." He paused. But it seems, the request for reflection feels like accusation when one's conscience is already stirred. There were no interruptions now. He walked slowly along the arc of chairs, each step deliberate, unthreatening, but unignorable. "I have spoken to victims," he continued. "Not just of abuse, but of abandonment. Parishioners who cried for help and received press statements. Survivors who begged for justice and were handed prudence. Families who left, not because they lost faith in Christ, but because they couldn't find him in us." A shuffle of shoes. A clearing of throat. But no response. Leo stopped in front of Cardinal Leclerc, the one who had earlier feared scandal dressed as virtue. Without looking down, Leo said, "You mistake my presence here for an attack on the Church. But I am not attacking the Church. I am defending it, from the very habit of mistaking image for integrity." He turned back to the full chamber. "Engagement," he said, "is not endorsement. And transparency is not betrayal." He stepped once more toward the center of the room, voice now softened but firmer still. "You call my openness dangerous. But the real danger was never the truth being revealed. It was that we became comfortable pretending it didn't exist." A whisper passed through the seats. Not words, just the rustle of discomfort clothed in velvet. "And let us not forget," Leo added, "when we defend the institution at all costs, we often abandon the mission that gave it breath." One of the older cardinals, eyes clouded with age but not with understanding, lowered his head. Another, younger, blinked rapidly, as if trying to unsee something already etched inside. Leo looked around, letting the moment breathe. Then, the final blow, not shouted, but delivered like scripture. "Silence is not protection. It is participation." And in that room, where centuries of dogma once drowned confession, there was only stillness now. No rebuttal. No correction. Just the unbearable sound of truth settling like dust on polished robes. If you believe the truth deserves a voice, don't let this story fade like the ones before it. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. And if you still won't, then leave your reason in the comments. Maybe it wasn't the Church that failed you, but the silence within it. Pope Leo let the silence linger, not to punish, but to allow the room to feel itself. The confrontation had passed, but what remained was not victory, it was weight. The kind that settles in the bones when something old has died quietly and something honest is asking to be born. He returned to the center of the chamber, eyes no longer focused on the hierarchy before him, but lifted, toward the unseen audience beyond the cameras. And toward the hearts that might still be listening. His voice softened. "This is not about 6 men," he said. "It is not about scandal or structure or public perception." He looked up toward the dome, its gilded edges catching slivers of morning light. "It is about the soul of the Church." His gaze returned to the faces around him, not as judge, not even as pope, but as a man who had bled with the forgotten and prayed with the betrayed. "I have no enemies in this room," he said. "Only brothers who have forgotten who they serve." There was no accusation in his tone. Only grief. Then, stepping beside the blackened rosary still resting on the table, he placed his hand gently beside it. "The real reform," he whispered, "will not be written in decrees. It begins where no camera can follow, inside the hearts of those willing to remember Christ before they remember rank." He looked to the gathering once more. I am not asking for resignation. I am asking for reflection. I offer no punishment, only the path back. There was no closing gavel. No ceremonial dismissal. Just the quiet closing of a heart made wide enough to hold both justice and grace. And with that, the synod ended. Not in applause. Not in protest. But in possibility. If that kind of church still matters to you, don't watch this and walk away unchanged. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. And if you can't, tell us in the comments, what part of you still needs healing? What would you have said in that room? Not with hindsight. Not with the comfort of distance. But if you were seated among robes, titles, and silence, would you have spoken? Would you have defended the dignity of tradition, or knelt beside a man who dared to say, "Let the image burn, if it hides the innocent"? Would you have whispered your agreement when no one was watching? Or would you have stood, even if only to remember what the church was always meant to be? This story, like many, will fade from headlines. But the questions it asked, will not. And they are not questions for cardinals alone. They are for you. For every believer who still wonders if faith can be honest. For every soul still limping away from a church that once claimed to protect them. For every heart that longs for repentance, not as performance, but as return. May we all seek truth with humble hearts, and never mistake silence for peace. If that blessing resonated deeper than words. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories, not for entertainment, but for conviction. And if you still won't, enter the comments and tell us, what truth are you still protecting from the light?